All right, good afternoon. My name is Steve McLeod. I am the current president of the Coastal Society, speaking with you today from Buffalo, New York. Thank you for joining this session of TCS's Coastal Connections web conferencing series. The trending topic we will cover today is adapting to rising seas, for which our guest presenters will discuss regional adaptation strategies for sea level rise. Please note that this session is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the TCS YouTube channel in the coming days for public viewing. For our non-member guests, the Coastal Society is a nonprofit organization founded in 1975 with a mission of fostering dialogue and advancing education to promote the wise use of our coastal resources. You can learn more about TCS and become a member at www.thecoastalsociety.org. It's up there in front of you on the screen. The Coastal Connection series is meant to better connect TCS members and guests from the coastal community throughout the year. Our intent is not just to learn from our expert guest panelists, but also to see and hear from you, our other participants, during the Q&A discussion period later in the session. We encourage you to turn on your camera and share your questions and thoughts at that time. Special thanks to Ashley Gordon and Melanie Perello for their support in organizing this series. Ashley, are there any logistical points that you would like to make at this time?
Thank you, Steve. Yes, just saying, as you noted, we'll hold the questions until the end, where we invite you to participate in the discussion and come on camera, and you can raise your hand using the feature at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to ask your question directly, or you're also welcome to post questions in the chat. As we noted, we are recording this session, and that will be shared on the Coastal Society's public YouTube channel. And then also at the end of the session, we will be sharing a link in the chat to a post-event survey, and we appreciate your feedback on that. So, thanks, Steve. Steve, you're on mute.
Thanks very much. Rookie mistake. I am now happy to introduce our moderator for today's session, Sydney Fishman. Sydney is the Shoreline Armoring Planning Associate at the Washington Department of Ecology. Her work focuses on the implementation of shoreline stabilization regulations on Puget Sound. She assists local governments and Department of Ecology staff with review of shoreline stabilization projects under local shoreline master programs. She reports regional efforts to address shoreline armoring and improve the health of Puget Sound shorelines. She also supports Washington's sea level rise planning efforts, including guidance, planning grants, and technical assistance to local governments. She holds a Master's of Environmental Management degree from Duke University. Sydney, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Steve. I want to welcome everybody, and we'll get started right away with our first presenter. So our first presenter is Whitney Gray. Whitney is a fifth-generation Floridian who joined Michael Baker International in 2021 as the Florida Program Manager for Resilience. She worked in the public sector starting in 2008 at local, regional, and state agency levels, assisting local governments to identify and address their vulnerabilities of their communities to flooding and sea level rise. She has been a leader in many sea level rise efforts in Florida, including the 2018 Florida Adaptation Planning Guidebook, the 2019 Sea Level Impact Projection, or SLIP rule and online tool, and the recently launched Resilient Florida grant program. And she'll be sharing more about many of these efforts today. So let's welcome Whitney.
Thank you, Sydney. I'm gonna take a moment here and get my screen share going. Thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to be back. I was fortunate to be able to moderate one of the last webinars that TCS put on. It's really nice to be back and to talk about what's going on in Florida these days. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about how sea level rise is affecting Florida, what the state as a state government is doing about it. Sea level rise is affecting communities all over Florida. And you may have seen this picture before of an octopus in the parking garage in Miami. South Florida has had some of the most famous, or rather infamous, effects of sea level rise, especially around the fall king tide season. like this time when an octopus actually came up through the stormwater system into an inundated parking garage. Not an ideal situation for the octopus or for the cars, for example, as well. King tide or high tide flooding in the fall is perhaps the worst when the northern hemisphere is closest to the sun, while the sun and the moon and the earth are all aligned, causing these extra high spring tides. Coastal communities experience saltwater flooding in low-lying areas and in places where stormwater outfalls are below mean high tide. The flooding is often called nuisance flooding, but it can be severe and prolonged, as in areas of the Florida Keys a few years ago when they experienced more than 80 days, consecutive days of saltwater flooding in one neighborhood in Key Largo. Many local governments in South Florida provide resources like websites and newsletters in advance of their king tide season for residents that show the projected days of flooding and parking alternatives to keep cars out of saltwater. And they also develop alert systems so that residents can sign up to receive flood warnings. So it's kind of a big deal in the fall. And it's not just in South Florida. Communities all over Florida are experiencing more frequent and severe flooding, both at the coast, where it's exacerbated by sea level rise, and inland, where changing rainfall patterns are overwhelming stormwater systems. New reports indicate that high tide flooding will affect more areas of the state more severely in the future. The 2021 State of High Tide Flooding and Annual Outlook report issued by NOAA last year documented that nationally high tide flooding occurred in 2020 at a rate that was twice what it was 20 years prior to that, and is expected to be 2 to 3 times higher still, with 7 to 15 days of annually of water depths of 1.8 feet. Now that's considered minor flooding by NOAA, but 1.8 feet of water in places where it's usually dry. And sea level rise, as we mentioned, exacerbates everything. While high tide flooding is this episodic event, sea level rise is gradual, chronic, and doesn't subside, making flooding from any other source worse. Over the past 100 years or so, tide gauges in Florida have measured increases in mean high tide up to over a foot. And the pace is increasing. Of the foot of sea level rise over the past 100 years, almost half of that has come in just the last 20 years. So what has the state decided to do about this? Well, over the past decade and a little more, the state of Florida has encouraged local governments to incorporate changing conditions from sea level rise into planning, with the goals of reducing flood risk and assessing vulnerability of infrastructure, managing stormwater surge and high tide events, and preserving natural and historic resources. And Florida's comprehensive planning laws provide requirements and tools to encourage that level of planning, such as a designation of an adaptation action area, which was established in 2011, which is an optional tool that is language that can be inserted into a comprehensive plan to designate an area that's subject to repeated flooding from sea level rise or other sources. This statute in 2011 was the first mention of sea level rise in Florida statutes. The peril of flood statute was signed by the governor in 2015 and goes a step beyond by requiring coastal communities in Florida to analyze current and future flooding from sea level rise, storm surge, precipitation, and other sources, to consider that in their redevelopment plans. In 2019, we saw the passage of the SLIP study law that Sydney mentioned, which requires state-funded coastal construction to be analyzed for flood risk before construction can begin. For the first time in Florida statute, a specific sea level rise projection was required by law to be analyzed. This legislation put the responsibility on the Florida Department of Environmental Protection for guiding resilience at the state agency level. There was an attempt to update this statute this year to expand the area where the SLIP studies are required. But the legislature kind of ran out of gas on that, but we do look for that to come back this next session. The screenshot on the right there shows where the coastal building zone is in the Miami area. And as you can see, this rule was kind of modeled on some of our coastal and beaches rules and laws. And so there are lots of vulnerable areas that aren't covered by it, but we hope that this will be improved in the next legislative session. And to help folks comply with the law, the Department of Environmental Protection created this sea level impact projection study tool, which is an online interactive map and helps you perform the required analysis, and then at no cost, and then allows the public to view all the submitted studies for 10 years. The tool provides a sea level rise viewer that anyone can use and includes an adaptation library that shows options for mitigating risks to coastal construction projects. And these adaptation options are custom to the location of the project, of the proposed project. In terms of programs that the state has come up with, starting back in 2017, DEP began the Florida Resilient Coastlines Program to assist coastal local governments with improving their resilience to flooding. And the program awarded grants for planning projects, such as conducting vulnerability assessments and amending comprehensive plans to reach compliance with the peril of flood requirements. The program coordinated closely with another state agency, the Florida Department of Economic Opportunity, which is actually the one with jurisdiction over comprehensive planning. Over 4 years, the program awarded over $6 million to 129 local governments and hosted a quarterly webinar called the Coastal Resilience Forum, which brought together folks from all over the state in many, many different sectors and highlighted resilience-related work around the state and the nation, providing inspiration and sometimes debate for resilience practitioners. The program also produced the Florida Adaptation Planning Guidebook, and this resource is based on several years of research on planning for adaptation, specifically in Florida, and is available free from the Department of Environmental Protection. One of the highlights of the guidebook is kind of a 4-step process that's recommended for adaptation planning, beginning with vulnerability assessment and going all the way through the prioritization of adaptation options. In 2021, the Resilient Florida program was created by the Florida legislature. We just can't get enough of that word resilience. And the legislature created this program, establishing a major funding and research program. In the first year, over $400 million was awarded for planning and infrastructure projects related to improving resilience. Although the program has a dedicated funding stream, federal funds from the American Rescue Plan Act added significantly to the funding pool for that first year, and additional federal funds are adding to the pool in the current year of funding, which is grant proposals are now being collected and reviewed. The interesting part about this piece of legislation is that it required proposed infrastructure projects to be backed up by a vulnerability assessment that shows that the project is actually needed to mitigate current or future flooding from sea level rise and other sea level rise, storm surge, precipitation, and the combinations of those sources. And for consistency among the vulnerability assessments, specific standards were put into the statute, including the use of 2 specific sea level rise projections at a minimum and 2 specific time horizons at a minimum. The program also included the creation of a statewide data set that would feed into a statewide vulnerability assessment and the creation of the Florida Flood Hub at the University of South Florida. In terms of next steps, we had some tries at legislation this past year that would kind of expand the policies that the state were providing on resilience. One bill would have allowed property owners to apply for a Resiliency Energy Environment Florida credit funding for qualified improvements to their property. And it also sought to change Florida's PACE program to some degree as well. And each year there are more and more bills in the Florida legislature aimed at helping to deal with the increasing problems associated with increasing flooding from sea level rise and other sources. The issues we're facing here are wide ranging. We start to look at the actual physical response to sea level rise, but the ripple effects go into the insurance industry, into beyond funding, into ways to improve local and regional coordination, as well as improving codes and other local ordinances. So all of these things kind of have a ripple effect and build upon each other. We're hopeful that with good science and continuing good leadership, Florida will continue to move forward in improving the resilience of local communities. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Look forward to questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Whitney. I particularly enjoyed your presentation because I did my master's project on sea level rise and specifically high tide flooding, but I was looking at Charleston and Annapolis. So it was great to hear about Florida because if you Google that, you're going to get examples of Florida. So really appreciated hearing that. I do want to remind folks, if you're not speaking, to please keep yourself muted. We will have an opportunity to come off mute at the end and ask questions, but for now, please keep yourselves muted. And I will now pass it to our second presenter, Ben McFarlane. Ben is a senior regional planner for the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, which is the regional planning organization for Southeastern Virginia. Mr. McFarlane has been with the HRPDC for 13 years, working primarily on the Commission's coastal resources management efforts. He is the lead planner for the Commission's work on coastal resiliency, coastal zone management, and military locality coordination. He received a BA in economics and a master's of urban and environmental planning from the University of Virginia. And he is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and a certified floodplain manager. Welcome, Ben. Your slides look great. And the audience, if you have questions that you think of for Ben or for Whitney, please do put them in the chat. Take it away, Ben.
Thank you, Sydney. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. Pleasure to be here to talk about some of the work that we're doing in Hampton Roads, Virginia, the southeastern corner of the state. A lot of work on resilience. We face a lot of the same issues that Whitney just talked about for Florida. Maybe not quite to the same extent for some of them, but we're feeling the same types of impacts all along the East Coast. So it's really good to have this panel here to be talking about the different approaches that we're taking at the different levels of government. So I'm going to be talking today a little bit about what we're doing regionally throughout the Hampton Roads region, but also give a case study of what one of our localities is doing as well towards the end. So for us here in Hampton Roads, we're no stranger to flooding. We have issues historically with hurricanes. We're on the coast, we're right on the water, so dealing with things like coastal erosion, major tidal events, heavy rainfall. Those are things that we're used to, but the frequency of those events is getting much more severe for us. And so we have kind of a number of issues that we're dealing with. We do have major storms that come in and they bring heavy rain, heavy wind, storm surge in many cases. And you can see some images there on the top from the city of Norfolk on the left and the city of Portsmouth at the Naval Medical Center there on the right, showing some of the impacts from some recent major storm events. But then we also get major flooding from heavy rain, as you can see there on the bottom left, or even just a abnormally high tide. And so for us, it's turning into an everyday thing. It's not quite there yet, but it's getting pretty close. And so figuring out what are the solutions, the strategies that we can adopt locally, regionally, and statewide to help to mitigate these impacts is a key focus for our agency here at the Planning District Commission. And so the first thing I want to talk about is an effort that we have underway right now to develop what we're calling regional resilient design guidelines. So this really stems from this realization that we have all of these policies, these public policies that we put into place that are intended to protect the public health, safety, and welfare. They're based on this assumption that the past is going to look like the future, or the future is going to look like the past and like the present. And what we know from climate science is that we are living in a non-stationary time, that the data that we have from previous eras is no longer going to be indicative of where things are headed. And so it's important for us to update those standards to take into account the uncertainty that we're dealing with and to take into account what we think the future is going to look like in order to make sure that the investments that we're making on both the public and the private side are done in such a way that those investments are able to function throughout their intended lifespan. And so what we're working on right now are coming up with policies to specifically amend our localities development ordinances and public facilities design standards to reflect those future standards or future conditions. And we're looking at trying to take advantage of the best available science. You saw some illustrations from Whitney's presentation of the kind of data that's out there. But this is we're in a world where we're dealing with a constantly moving target. And so constantly updating, reassessing what these policies are is going to be the name of the game from now into the future. So one of the things that we're trying to keep in mind in developing these policies is that's not a, there's no silver bullet here. It's not a one size fits all approach, but also that we have to be realistic about what we can do. And so we're trying, we want to base these policies on science, but we know that we can't just do the highest and the best. The standards that we're adopting have to be appropriate to the kind of situations and decisions that we're looking at, and they have to be implementable. If we come up with a solution or a strategy that is just too pie in the sky, or it's based on too much of a worst case scenario, that really doesn't do us any good when it comes to actually developing strategies that people can actually use in their day-to-day lives. And so for this effort, these resilient design guidelines, we have 4 different things that we're looking at: sea level rise scenarios, tailwater elevations, precipitation scenarios, and then also what we're calling joint probability events. And these are all looking at kind of what are the ways that we have to deal with water here in Hampton Roads. And some of these are probably applicable to other regions along the coast, more or less. But a lot of them are, we're trying to take advantage of the work that's been done by, within our region and also in other parts of the country and by federal agencies, state agencies, to kind of come up with these implementable policies that our localities here in Hampton Roads can adopt as part of their ordinances and local policies. So the first thing that we adopted back in 2018 was a set of regional sea level rise planning scenarios. We took advantage of the work that was coming out of NOAA and also some of the local folks here working at Old Dominion University and the Virginia Institute of Marine Science to look at kind of what are the projections of sea level rise, what scenarios from a planning perspective really make sense. How do we actually use these curves? We have these sets of sea level rise scenarios from NOAA or from the IPC or from any of these larger groups that are putting together this work. They don't tell you which curve to use. So you have to make a judgment call about how you're actually going to take advantage of these scenarios and use them to actually make decisions. And in our case, when we looked at these scenarios, and at the time, we didn't really think that any one of these scenarios was a good enough choice to just pick that one. That's a kind of an ongoing debate here in Virginia. Do we pick one curve or do we use multiple curves? For our localities, we worked with our Coastal Resiliency Committee here that has local staff members from throughout the Hampton Roads. And we looked at these scenarios, these curves, and adopted 3 different planning scenarios that we thought would be robust across multiple different possible futures. So from the period of 2020 to 2050, we picked 1.5 feet, from 2050 to 2080, 3 feet, and then from 2080 to 2100, 4.5 feet. And this policy was actually adopted by our board as a recommendation to all of our member localities in October 2018. And this is really the foundational policy at the regional level that we're using that informs the rest of the work that I'm going to be talking about here in a moment. But one thing I will mention is that we have recently gone about reassessing this policy in light of the new report that came out from NOAA earlier this year. And so what we found is that, and I think if any of you have actually read through this report, that the lowest scenarios kind of bumped up a little bit, the highest scenarios bumped down a little bit. There's a lot of compression there, but for us, through the 3 different sea level rise scenarios that we use are still valid. They're still good. They're still solid. They're not necessarily what we're going to use for every single decision, but for the types of planning that we need to be doing at the regional and local level, they still work. And so we were really happy to see that they were still valid across even now that we're 5 years later into using them. And so I mentioned before that we're using our sea level rise scenarios to kind of build into these other policies. And one of those is the development and adoption of tailwater elevations. So, for those of you that aren't familiar with stormwater management in urban areas, we have in Hampton Roads, we have separate storm sewer systems. So if you live in a bigger city, like say Richmond or Washington, DC, or some of the other older cities along the East Coast that have combined systems, we have separate systems here in Hampton Roads. So all of our stormwater systems drain directly to, for the vast majority, drain directly to a tidal body of water. But when you're building those systems and designing them, you have to account for what the tide is going to be doing. And right now, the default assumptions don't factor in sea level rise. And we know that we're already seeing sea level rise significantly enough over the last 20 years to say that what the baseline assumptions in the existing regulations are not good enough. And so the more we let sea level rise, that decreases the capacity of our systems to actually deal with rainwater, with precipitation, when that occurs. And so taking that into account, coming up with numbers that don't just work today, but that will work into the future is critical in order to make sure that our stormwater systems are functioning the way they should. And so what we've done is we've taken advantage of some work from FEMA, from the Corps of Engineers, and we've done some analysis of the different watersheds throughout Hampton Roads. And we've calculated what those design elevations should be with all of our different sea level rise scenarios. So we have for the present day with that 1.5 feet, 3 feet, and 4.5 feet of sea level rise for a suite of different storm scenarios, return periods that we've done for all of our coastal communities here in Hampton Roads. So that's not our entire region, but it's most of it. And you can see here in the illustration here, this is for the city of Chesapeake on the south side of Hampton Roads, just an example showing what those proposed design tidal elevations would be. We're also looking at precipitation. What we've seen recently is that we're seeing a lot of change. This is something that's being felt not only in Virginia, but nationwide and globally as well. That we know that the data we have that we use to make decisions about stormwater management in particular, but also about a number of other policies that are out there, is old. It's old. It's out of date. The last update that we had in Virginia for the official NOAA Atlas 14 volume that we use, I believe the cutoff for the data for that was the year 2000. It was last published in 2004, 2005. And so really this data, it's out of date already, but it also doesn't account for what future change is going to look like. And so we know from climate modeling, from some work that's been done locally, but also at the state level, that there is a good chance that our precipitation patterns are going to change significantly enough to merit changes to the actual values that we're using. And we're kind of working through how we're going to do this at the state level. At the local level, we're really looking closely with our localities to take advantage of some work that's been done locally to develop updated standards that take into account what our future climate is projected to look like. And so this is what the kind of policy that we're looking at here. We've taken the baseline values from Atlas 14. We used a tool developed by the RAND Corporation and Marissa that looks at climate projections and has calculated modifiers for that existing Atlas 14 document throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And then what we've done is we've looked at those. And again, as with the sea level rise scenarios, they offer you a lot of different options for which actual numbers you might use, but they don't tell you which one is the best one. So you could use the median, you could use the 75th percentile, the 90th percent. What we've done is instead, we looked at all the different options that were available. We looked at how much impervious cover each of our localities has to see kind of how much wiggle room they might have, how much room for error. And what we've done is we've calculated kind of an average multiplier that we're recommending for different sets of our localities. And you can see there in the slide that the group at the top, those are more rural localities, smaller localities that have a lot less impervious cover. The ones in the middle are a little bit more suburban, so they still have pretty substantial forest cover, pervious, like turf and crops and whatnot. And then the localities at the bottom there in that group those are the most urbanized communities in Hampton Roads. So they're the ones that have the least room. If rainfall ends up being a lot more than is forecast, they're the ones that would suffer the largest consequences from having an undersized standard. And so for them, having a 20% increase above the existing Atlas 14 is the recommended value. We're also starting to look at what we're calling these joint probability events, or specifically looking at both tidal and precipitation events at the same time. So right now, in a lot of cases, we might have a rainfall storm. That's the design storm is based on just on rain, but it doesn't take into account that there might be some overlap between when certain tidal events happen and when certain rainfall events happen. And so coming up with a pair of a design tidal event and a design rainfall event to make sure that for our coastal communities, especially, that they're the ones that they have a design storm that actually reflects what things will look like when you look at both of those types of impacts together. So we, here in Hampton Roads, mentioned before, we have the separate storm sewer systems. Those already back up. There's a high tide, even just a normal high tide, which limits the capacity of our communities or their stormwater systems to actually deal with that kind of flooding. We have one of our communities, Virginia Beach, has already adopted this as part of its public facilities manual, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on. But we think this is a good approach. We think this is something that's valid and that should be considered by all of our coastal communities. And so what we've done is taken a similar approach to Virginia Beach, and we've looked at these combinations of tides and rain. And so, for example, the 1-year design storm would actually be the 10-year tidal event and the 1-year rainfall, or the 25-year design storm would be the 2-year tidal event and the 25-year rainfall. So by looking at both of these types of impacts together, we can have a much more realistic, a better performing design standard for our local stormwater infrastructure. And then, so, I talked a lot about, what we're doing regionally, and these are all policies that we're still working on. I'm hopeful that we'll have something kind of final within the next few months that our commission might consider actually adopting, similar to our sea level rise policy. But one of the most exciting things that's happening here in Hampton Roads recently has been this effort by Virginia Beach for them to become sea level wise. And I did not come up with that name, but it's actually, it's kind of sticks, right? So we're really excited to see this work. They have invested quite a bit of time in resources, other resources to develop this plan. And it's not just a plan that's sitting on the shelf, it's starting to be implemented already. And so that's very exciting here for us in Hampton Roads to have our largest community directly engaging this issue to the extent that they are. And so their approach really has taken kind of an engineering approach to it. They've done quite a bit of modeling. They've looked at socioeconomic analyses. They've developed different types of strategies for different types of communities. Virginia Beach is a very large community. And so coming up with strategies that will work in different types of places, like whether it's an older suburban community, say, for example, I live in a neighborhood that was built in 1960, or it might be a community that was built only 10 or 15 years ago. Different conditions in those, different conditions in the infrastructure, different types of development patterns, different amounts of existing natural resources in those or nature-based features. Figuring out ways that you can take advantage of what's already there, or at least deal with the conditions that you're actually going to find, because there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach in Virginia Beach. It's just too big and too diverse of a community. So, I mentioned some of the analysis they've done. They've conducted the impact analysis. They looked at the different options that were out there for adaptation strategies. They developed a strategy, and now they're in the middle, or actually really at the beginning of their implementation of this long-term strategy. And so I mentioned before different strategies for different types of places. This illustration here, it shows 4 of the different major watersheds for Virginia Beach. If you're familiar with Hampton Roads at all, the Lynnhaven River, that comes directly off of the Chesapeake Bay. The ocean front, what we're known for here, the beach. Elizabeth River is actually it's a very developed urbanized riverfront that extends, goes all the way from the Hampton Roads body of water. That's at the mouth of the James River, goes through the city of Norfolk and the city of Portsmouth all the way into Virginia Beach. So a very different type of waterfront than you might find on the Lynnhaven or the ocean front. And then, an area that is becoming even, I think, more problematic sooner than expected are these areas we call the Southern Rivers that are part of the Albemarle-Pamlico watershed that is mostly in North Carolina, but it extends into parts of Southampton Roads. And that area in particular has very different situation than what you might find in the rest of the city, and coming up with strategies that work down there where it's a much less developed part of the city. It's very rural, a lot of farmland still down there, very different conditions when it comes to how they actually can manage the water. So coming up with these different types of strategies that are appropriate to these different kind of neighborhoods or subregions of the city has been critical to developing a plan that might actually work. I mentioned, so, our regional policies that we're working on. Virginia Beach has really led the way in a lot of this. And this illustration here, this is the cover of their Public Works Design Standards Manual. A lot of the values, a lot of the different things that we're working on, analyzing and developing, recommendations for the rest of Hampton Roads. Virginia Beach has already done this work. And so we're able to really take advantage of that. It's really helpful to have our largest community, our highest capacity community, really kind of leading the charge on this. But they've actually already adopted these policies and they're implementing them right now. And then the last thing I have a slide for here is probably the most exciting thing here is that last fall, Virginia Beach, they had a referendum for a bond issuance that would provide about $500 million specifically for flood protection. And you can see from the illustration here the different components that are going to be flooded or funded from the bond proceeds there. This is phase one of the city's flood protection program. And as a result of that bond referendum, they're going to be able to implement this whole phase one over the next 10 years instead of the next 30 years. And it contains a wide variety of different types of projects: stormwater management, drainage improvements, pump stations, natural infrastructure, marsh restoration, all across the city. So it's very exciting. They're already in the process of starting to issue bid documents for some of these projects and getting underway. They have quite the ambitious plan to get this done over the next 10 years. And we're going to be really excited to see this play out. And then also one thing I'll just mention, in addition to that, is that Virginia Beach was recently successful in getting a new START authorization for a coastal storm risk management study with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which is another key effort that localities, across the nation are really going to be able to take advantage of, need to be able to utilize in order to get access to some of the federal funding through the Corps. We know that's an oversubscribed program, but we're really excited to see Virginia Beach, take part of that. And we're also excited to see that most recently that we're actually going to be able to have some additional participation from the U.S. Navy as part of that project as well. So something that we weren't able to get earlier on when Norfolk, one of our other cities, had one of these studies. But Virginia Beach, we're gonna see that collaboration and coordination mostly between Joint Expeditionary Base Little Creek Fort Story, and then also Oceana Naval Air Station. So really exciting stuff going on here in Hampton Roads. And I know we're going to hold questions for the end. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciated hearing about your work, because the Washington Department of Ecology, my agency, also works really closely with different local governments, trying to figure out how to translate the different sea level rise projections and help them choose. So really appreciate hearing about what you're doing in Virginia. And it looks like you've got a couple questions. A reminder again for folks, please put your questions in the chat if they come to your mind. And folks have been saying if it's directed for a certain panelist, also please share that, say like at Ben or at Seth. And speaking of Seth, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our final presenter. Seth Blitch is a 5th generation Floridian who moved to Louisiana in 2011 to take a position with the Nature Conservancy. He serves as the Director of Coastal and Marine Conservation for the Louisiana chapter. He is involved in the Gulf of Mexico, the South Atlantic, and beyond in the recovery of oyster resources as a habitat and fishery through restoration projects, convening stakeholders, and policy and management engagement. He manages these and other natural infrastructure projects and the development and application of decision support tools aimed at coastal resiliency. Additionally, he works with colleagues in the freshwater sphere to develop and implement projects that account for and improve the connectivity among freshwater resources and their impact to coastal processes and ecosystems. And he also oversees longleaf pine restoration and migratory bird habitat projects. So he's a very busy guy. Let's go ahead and welcome Seth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sydney, and I'm happy to be here, and so hello to all of you. Yes, all of us are busy. Anybody in this field is busy. So I was going to just talk a bit about. Well, first of all, I'm going to start my timer, so I only talk 15 minutes. Okay, about mostly Louisiana and largely around a lot of what the Nature Conservancy does, but I will touch on. I'm actually grateful for the previous two speakers talking about how things play out at more of a state and municipal level, because I will not hit that quite as hard. And I will tell you that this is sort of an amalgam of several presentations I've given recently. Some of the stuff is way too remedial for this audience, so I will blast through it, but the Coastal Society folks have a copy of this presentation if you really want to see it. But I have given this to all kinds of people, but here's a quick and dirty of how sea level rise works. And here's some very grim facts about what that looks like. And I included this information because in 2018, I actually got to go to Greenland. And just like when I moved to Louisiana, Louisiana has the highest rate of relative sea level rise on the planet, meaning that the platform that the Mississippi River Belt is subsiding, which is a natural process, but it's subsiding pretty quickly. in the face of unprecedented sea level rise. And so that difference of sort of both subsiding and rising is greater than anywhere else. And when you look at some of these metrics, like as much as a 2-meter increase by 2100, that is that's a pretty grim prospect for low-lying places, especially in the Gulf and especially places like Louisiana. So being in a place like Louisiana, which is so heavily affected by the change in sea level, and then getting to visit a place like Greenland, which is a contributing factor. It's not the only thing. The thermal expansion of the ocean really makes a big deal too. But was say nice to make that link. It was a pretty profound way to think about what happens in one part of the globe and how it affects another. Again, it's just, gigatons is almost a meaningless term, at least it was to me, other than it was really, really big, until I actually got to see some of these features. And the only point in showing these slides is the upper left, I thought of calving icebergs as something that was rare, and I got to watch it every day I was there. You can see, the face of this iceberg is just, kind of sheared off, and the picture immediately below it is, a giant glacier, coming through this moraine, and you can see, I'll put my cursor on it. I will not do that. Yeah, there, where that's a very recent retreat. This indicates that it was way out in this bay, and this indicates really recent retreat. And then I put these in the upper right, just because if there was a cruise ship next to it, it would look diminutive, just to get a sense of how much water is there. And that's the only thing going on. And then speaking of the waters, I tested them while I was there. Really cold. So what does this and other things mean for Louisiana and the Gulf of Mexico, and such as climate change? And there are other things that we have to consider that I think play on the resilience, that are climate related, that play on the resilience of coast, like warming oceans and acidifications. When those things impact coral reefs and shellfish reefs and they're lost, then those natural breakwaters and natural ways to maintain water quality are diminished. In the Gulf, we're heavily acquainted with the increased strength and frequency of storms. In 2020, we had the worst storm ever in Louisiana, and everyone thought, oh, Katrina's it. And then we had it in Hurricane Laura, and then we thought, oh, well, that's it. And then last year we had Hurricane Ida, which was even worse. Louisiana is frequently number one in things that are things you don't want to be number one in. This was mentioned, but changes in freshwater and sediment supply really affect, that connectivity really affects what goes on in the coastal zone. And when those processes are altered, the accretion that sometimes offsets or helps mitigate erosion and land loss is lost. And so that exacerbates situations. And then we see changes in habitats, which offer suite of ecosystem services to sort of, build in a lot of resilience, naturally and for free to places. And again, climate changes and climate affect those habitats as well. So this just shows you, this is Grand Isle. This is sort of in the southeast part of Louisiana, and it shows you, sort of what it looks like back in 2010, so 12 years ago. And if you expected a 10-year storm event, you can see how much inundation there is in the middle image. And then in 2060 is sort of an effort to look at what it might look like with the same 10-year storm coupled with sea level rise. And you can see that nearly all of the island, except for the foredune, is underwater. And so that's the questions, right? People are going to sink, swim, or move, and it's still open to furious and continuous debate, I would say, not just in Louisiana, but everywhere. And then I wanted to show you this image, which I use a lot because it will give you, I think, a really sense of the degree to which we are converting coastal wetlands to open water in Louisiana. This is an image of that same area, Grand Isle. To orient, New Orleans is basically just off the screen, but it's just due north of Grand Isle. So this is in 1932. This is what the coast looked. This is what it looked like in 2011. I don't know if you can see this, but you might notice a slight difference. So that's a lot of what we're contending with. And again, it's not unique to Louisiana, but I think it's pretty profound here. It's easy to see. I often get reporters call and say, "Can you take me to see the land loss?" I'm like, it's not quite like that, but I can take you out in the boat and turn on a map and show you that the areas that were in the boat were actually, land when the software was made. So are we doomed? No, probably not. But we are doomed to have to change. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit the rest of this presentation about nature-based solutions. I actually think of them more as nature-based responses. And this is a graphic that just sort of shows what those are and is consistent with what you just heard from the other two presenters. This is what I will say about Louisiana is that we do have a master plan for the coast. The state does through the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority. It is in review every 5 years, and the new version is scheduled to come out next year. You can go online and find this fairly easily. And a lot of what this plan looks at is reconnecting the Mississippi River and its freshwater and sediment to the coast. If you don't know, the Mississippi is levied off from the southern tip of Illinois around Cairo all the way to the mouth of the river. So all of that water and that sediment that used to help nourish the coast and maintain coastal processes has been severed since well into last year, so for decades and decades. And that, among other things, has had a really serious influence on the way the coast does or doesn't perform here. So oysters, as Sydney's introduction may have alerted you to, I do a lot of oyster work. So bringing back shellfish reefs. Shellfish are natural breakwaters. They're managed exclusively pretty much everywhere in this country as a fishery, but they like seagrass beds and mangroves and salt marshes and other coastal habitats are a habitat. They're unique, in fact, in that they're both a habitat and a fishery, but they're primarily managed as a fishery. And so there's a lot of thinking around not having that kind of dualism, but really having, stop the either or discussions that can be really polarizing and think about the resource when it comes to shellfish reefs as it's a habitat and a fishery. And you can have both, especially given the rate at which we have lost shellfish reefs, especially oysters all around this country over the last 100 years. This is actually a reef in Apalachicola. This is for another time, but if you want to know how oysters do it, this is how it works. And then here's other ways to think about it. A lot of times people will say, well, we've got plenty of oysters in Galveston, but that's often when you put material on the bottom and grow them. And so when you look at the profile of those oysters in a side stand sonar, they're almost at grade and they're very low. So all of the shoreline protection that you would get from a reef that is at grade is pretty much lost. And if you look at Sabine Reef on the left here, that has been unharvested and largely undamaged since about 1966. And so the reef in places is over a meter tall. And even though it is a subtidal reef, not immediately adjacent to the shore, it confers a lot of shoreline protection to the adjacent shoreline in that part of Sabine Lake, which is the lake that's on the border between Louisiana and Texas. So TCS is not the only group to do this, but there are a lot of groups that build reefs. And often that just means putting out substrate in the water where you have plenty of larvae, but where you are limited by substrate, where there is no more substrate. As you can see, we're using rock in baskets. I would prefer to use shell, but shell is really hard to get. So we buy rock and they get put into these baskets. We put them at a contour that lets them be intertidal, meaning at a really, really low tide in the winter, they're exposed, and most of the time they're just under the surface. But we know from the monitoring that the rates of shoreline erosion are slowed, occasionally reversed. And when we site it right, where we have the right salinity regime, then we actually grow oysters. And when we grow oysters, they maintain themselves over space and time. And as they do that, they work to improve and maintain water quality. Let's get this one. Provide habitat for all kinds of fish and shrimp and crabs and things that are ecologically, economically important to areas locally. Here is another just series of shots again that shows you sort of how it works and what's involved. And then here they are going in the water. This was last year in Calcasieu Lake, and you can see, they go in, they're inert. Again, it's a box of rocks. But after just about 1.5 years on the right, you can see that you can still see the wire and some of the rock, but that's a lot of oysters. And if you multiply that by 6 foot across times 1 mile long, that's a lot of oysters. And so, we feel pretty good about some of these projects. Certainly we've had some that have performed better than others, but we've also learned a lot over the whole community has over the last several years. This happens in Texas too. These are subtidal reefs. They're measured in acres rather than linearly, but these are really large projects. That especially the one in the middle half moon is like 60 acres, and it has brought back tons and tons of oysters, literally tons of oysters. Lots of rock again go in. You can get a sense of some of the costs here, and also from the very bottom of this image, you can tell that none of these projects are done without partners, and this just sort of shows how that works. And then this was a study we did with Sea Grant that showed that beyond sort of the benefits we were hoping to get, there are economic benefits too in terms of anglers who come there and sort of, increase revenues that can be realized by communities in terms of both the restoration economy and jobs, and as well as, again, recreational anglers and others. Shell recycling is another obvious way to get oysters back in the water instead of having shells end up in landfills. And we're doing this in Mississippi, working with a lot of restaurants. Here are the sites along the Mississippi coast where shells will be deployed. It's great if you can grow oysters and put the shells back in, then you're not digging a hole in the ground somewhere else and transporting it across states. You're actually, eating oysters could be an act of conservation and resilience with the shells, make it back into the water. And there's a couple other technologies just to give you an idea of what that looks like. And then I just put these different watersheds in, the one that reaches into Galveston Bay, the Mississippi River, and the Apalachicola, because water has so much to do with what oysters and other habitats, how they respond, again, that connectivity. And so just these are three different and very large, but still very different scales at which I think a lot of this needs to be considered when you think about resilience along the coast. And then here's another image of just over the space of, I think it's like 5 or so years, where you can see that the shoreline actually was pulled out by these breakwaters, and it allowed a reef to recover and grow along the shoreline. This is by no way a panacea, but it is one of the many things that can be done. Recovering lost habitats like oysters. We're learning more and more about it and have had pretty good success. Other things which I think will be familiar to everyone here are just things like these HESCO baskets that get filled with sediment. This is a project we did where it was meant to, there are areas in the marsh in Louisiana that were being blown out where there were pipeline canals. And we actually sealed those off with a habitat that would grow and maintain itself over time and even spread. And it has done that, as well as reduce the cost and frequency of the pipeline maintenance, because they don't have an open canal that is blown out during tidal events. And then there are larger scale projects. This is in Alabama. This is where, again, we work with partners to re-meander a lot of these tidal creeks that were lost when this area was turned into more of a port. And this is right when most of the construction work was finished. It has already been populated with plants. Lots of shorebirds are nesting. And again, you can see the depth of the project, meaning that that's a little bit of risk reduction for all that infrastructure that's behind it. Here's another example around the Florida-Alabama border, where again, we've done some things to improve nesting for seabirds, but it also reestablishes an island. It doesn't do anything to address sea level rise, but like I said, that's why I think of it as nature-based responses more than solutions. And then acquisition, which is what the Nature Conservancy is, I think, known by most people for. And this is an image in Grand Isle where we actually, almost any treed space on the island is owned and managed by Grand Isle. We originally did it because it's a migratory pathway for birds. It's a very important migratory pathway for birds. Here's a few examples. But it turns out, just last year, we noticed anecdotally, after Hurricane Ida, the structures that were closest to our preserve were the ones that probably sustained the least amount of damage. And it was pretty easy just to go there and look and see that. And so just, again, having a forest and the resilience that forest gives to built infrastructure was obvious to see. 17,000 acre acquisition along the Texas coast several years ago through Deepwater Horizon money, again, created all that open space, which for the communities near it matters. And here's some other examples in Florida. So I'm going to get to the tools very quickly. This is an area that I work in, but I am not a tool guy. I fall out on the application side more than the development side. Don't ask me any algorithm questions. I won't know. We have a National Solutions Toolkit, which has ways, was built with users in mind to look at lots of different ways to think about resilience through a freshwater network, through floodplains along the coast, things like that. Here's the freshwater network. It's freshwaternetwork.org if you want to check it out, but it looks at things at watershed scales all through the US and at different HUC levels down to catchments. So you can really look at the relationships for things like nutrients and flow or dams or ecological flows and things like that at a catchment level or among catchments and compare them. And it's pretty handy when you're thinking about connectivity. Here's some more examples of that. Here's the water quality resource map. But again, that's sort of that image that's the second from the left. It just shows different levels of impairment. And so if you're thinking about a large project around connectivity, you can think about it, what scales you need to work and what specific catchments or water or parts of a watershed or basin that you really need to focus your efforts to get the kind of results that you want, whether you're trying to improve sediment, freshwater delivery, reduce nutrients, or whatever it is. These apps we've also developed apps that look at how flows or how connectivity in two areas, both Sabine and Calcasieu in Louisiana, impact oysters, taking a lot of in real-time in situ data, and again, are looking at how changes in operation, like if the Corps were to operate the Toledo Bend Reservoir differently, how would that impact oysters in Sabine Lake? Intellectually, I think probably most of you know how that works, but it's nice to go to a parish president or something like that and say, look, this is what this means. This is what you can expect, and this is what it means for the habitat and potentially for the industry. As you can see, there's lots of other things. We have a coastal community rating system, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And we developed an app for that, and we've worked with a lot of communities so that they can think about open space, moving critical infrastructure out of very at-risk places and things like that, that increase the resiliency of those communities to the degree that they can actually potentially get a break on their national flood insurance. That's probably way more than enough. Thanks for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Seth. I really enjoyed the photos and all the partnerships. I think partnerships are so incredibly important. So now we are going to move into the Q&A. We do recognize that we're basically at time for the hour. So if you do have to leave, we understand. Please look out for the survey that's going to be posted in the chat so you can give us some feedback on the webinar. But if you are able to stay, we would love to have you and to continue the discussion. We've already gotten some questions in the chat. Please continue to post them, and please say whether it's for a specific speaker or directed at multiple or all of them. And if you are comfortable, we will also be doing some verbal Q&A. So if you want to raise your hand to ask a question verbally, we have the reactions button at the bottom of the screen. It's a little smiley face. You can click on that, and then there's a raise hand button. So I can call on you if you do feel comfortable asking your question verbally. And we also invite you to turn your cameras on for the discussion part. So first, we have a question from Mike, and I think this question is for all of the panelists. The question is, how many plans in which the speakers are involved mention, much less elaborate on the critical words of planned retreat? And sorry, Ashley, or was someone else wanting to say something before we go into Q&A? No? Okay, then let's jump right in. So if any of our speakers want to talk about planned retreat and how your plans or your work might touch on that very important concept.
Okay.
I'll give it.
Go ahead, Seth.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's tricky. My experience, I always think of it as back in this might be a bad comparison, but in 1980, when Mount St. Helens exploded, there were a number of people who lived on the mountain that had such incredible site fidelity that they said, like, we're going to be fine. We're not going to move. This is our home. And they died. And that's a lot of my experience, having lived and worked on the Gulf for over 30 years. There's a real visceral connection to place. And the threat is a lot slower than something like Mount St. Helens. But there are communities that are talking about moving and managed retreat. And there are some state and municipal programs that consider that, and some of the things that TNC does. I mean, some of the oyster work, you can only grow oysters where you have the right salinities, but it is something that can migrate. I mentioned acquisition. I still think that we're trying to actually look at the southwest part of the state and recreate, conserve prairies and things like that, anticipating the future shoreline, so that when the future coast is there, it is more resilient probably than the coast is now. And I think those are some of the things. I have a colleague in Virginia actually that is working with the community of Oyster Bay to talk about how they're going to manage their retreat. So, it's a tough thing. Louisiana actually has a State Department that is doing that with communities, and it's been tricky. Places like Homa are really reticent to move, even though they have water under their homes every day.
Can I chime in here? Sydney, is that okay? Since I asked the question.
I know Ben wanted to respond. I'd like to.
Okay, all right, go ahead. And then,
Yeah, just real quickly, the short answer is yes. Several of our communities have already acquired properties that are in flood prone areas, and they're looking at that on a more systemic level. I think the issue is it's not probably as large as I think some people think it might need to be. It's really, it is a hard, complex question, particularly in more urbanized communities. And the communities that are less urbanized and more rural are going to be, well, they have fewer properties that are actually located on the coast that might require that sort of action. But it is being discussed. I don't think anybody has a full-on plan that would look at moving whole neighborhoods. Nothing in Virginia, at least on the level of, say, what's been done, you know, on the Mississippi with some of the riverine communities there, or even the Ile de Saint Jean in Louisiana is another example. As I think the poster child right now of relocation in response to sea level rise. We don't have anything like that in Virginia.
Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that Sydney didn't read because of time, I understand, was my prelude to that question, and that is, sea level rise is not like a storm. Storms come and go. This is a permanent change of state. Permanent change of state that in fact won't stop at the 2100 figures, but will continue for at least the next century or two. My point is that we're doing all of our sustainability planning under the assumption that most people on the coast will be able to stay where they are into the indefinite future. That's totally false. And so, I mean, I'm just beating on people. Some of you already did. If the words planned retreat are not in your plan of discussion, you actually don't have a sea level rise. And in fact, Seth, I was on the Science and Engineering Board that helped develop the 2017 plan. I think you and I may have met, but I can tell you that plan does not even mention planned retreat. And that's for South Louisiana, which is going to be totally underwater in 50 years.
Yeah,
so there's not a question of whether those communities are going to stay there. There's just no question in the 50-year time frame whether those communities are going to stay there. Even Fishman, if it stays at all, will be an offshore island, some 20 or 30 miles offshore.
No argument. I did not include the USGS map of Louisiana and sort of what the projected sea level rise over the next 100 years. But it's, I mean, if you look at that, that's what Mike just described is what's happening. So, and I do remember you seeing your name on that version of the report. But that being the case, I still think it's what Ben and I have described speaks to sort of against what is happening and how difficult it is often to respond at the community level, even if that's what's going to happen.
I think that we shouldn't underplay though some of the efforts that are being made on a smaller scale. Ben mentioned buyouts, and that reminded me that the state has in Florida has funded through the SNU program some pretty impressive buyout programs in local communities. And, when you're talking about moving people out of the flood danger, out of the floodplain or out of harm's way, I mean, I still think you should count that as some form of planned retreat or managed retreat. I think there are places, localities in Florida that are considering that are talking about it. It's still really a third rail issue. It really is. And, until some of our elected officials have 50-year terms, then we might not see a big movement on that. Now that I'm in the private sector, I can say stuff like that.
Good.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation and Mike for chiming in too. If it's all right, there are a couple other questions that we got in the chat, and they're actually for Ben. So Ben, I'll read both of the questions. The first one you can answer, and I'll do the second. So the first question we got for you from Nathaniel said, does Virginia Beach's policy response include incorporating sea level rise scenarios into zoning or building codes? I keep seeing new construction in coastal communities in areas that will likely be impacted by climate change within the 30-year window of a traditional mortgage.
So yes and no. They do have a freeboard standard of 2 feet above the BFE but that does not, it's not explicitly intended to account for sea level rise. And they haven't amended that as part of their sea level rise planning strategy yet. But I think that's something that's under consideration. The stormwater standards that I did mention, those do have to account for sea level rise. So if it's non-critical infrastructure that they're building, it has to account for 1.5 feet of sea level rise when they're doing their design calculations. And then if it's a critical infrastructure project, it has to account for 3 feet of sea level rise. And so that's where those tailwater or design standards plus sea level rise, that's where those calculations come into play there. I will say that one of the things that we're working on right now regionally is the development of kind of future projected floodplains. Using the LiDAR data that we have, combining some of the riverine floodplain information we have for the more inland areas with the coastal floodplain information that we have. And that's something that our localities, once that's done, would have that available to, elect on their own to put in place additional requirements for future floodplains beyond what they already require for the special flood hazard area.
Great, thanks. And then the second question, Heidi was curious about implementation for public versus private development. Are there any local governments beyond Virginia Beach that are implementing for private development? And what kind of reaction is Virginia Beach getting from developers?
Well, people think it costs too much. I think that's the short answer of it. When Virginia Beach adopted their 2-foot freeboard requirement, they actually were thinking about 3, and it got whittled down to 2 because of some pressure from the development industry. They have recently kind of reduced some of the requirements in those public works design standards manual in response to some complaints and issues by developers because of the expense involved. And so, the top line stuff remains the same, but there's some kind of very much in the weeds policies that and I think the other question was about other communities. And we have other examples of communities in Hampton Roads that are adopting different types of standards. We have some that are regulating the 0.2% special flood hazard area annual chance floodplain. We have some that are putting in place resilience. Norfolk, for example, has a resilience quotient requirement. So if you're doing a redevelopment project there, you have to score a certain number of points if you're in the coastal area in order to get approval for that redevelopment. So there are a lot of different strategies that are underway. I don't think anybody yet at the local level is regulating, a future floodplain like I mentioned before. At the state level, there are some executive orders and policies on the books that do apply to that, but those are not local. And all these policies, they all apply to private and public development, because the private developers, when they come in, they have to, comply with the freeboard. If they're building something that has stormwater management infrastructure, they have to comply with the city's stormwater management regulations because of the way that the stormwater management laws and regs are set up in Virginia. Most of our urban communities have MS4 permits. Familiar for that, the municipal storm sewer system. Except, I'm gonna get the S's wrong, but there's 4 S's in there, MS4. And those regulations require, those apply to both private and public projects.
Great, thanks, Ben. I did want to ask, I had a question in mind as I was listening to everyone talk, and your response made me think about that a little bit. So I'd love to hear from Whitney and then also from Seth a little bit about just how politics play into these things. I know Florida and sea level rise, that may have been a touchy subject, but Whitney, I'm curious to hear if you could speak to how politics in around sea level rise in Florida have shifted, or about developers, because I know Miami especially is a development hotspot and such a sea level rise hotspot.
Well, I will say that we have over the years have gone through a seismic shift. There was the era under a previous governor when it was not good form to speak about climate change. When we started the Florida Resilient Coastlines program in 2017, that was an attempt to turn that around. And so I think that was a very positive step. It's interesting though, while there is varying levels, I think at the state agency level, varying levels of addressing climate change and sea level rise. It's even a little bit more all over the map at the local level. It's definitely, it can be an obstacle. But I think, as we know from a variety of other settings, when there's a matter of, when it's hard to talk about something, we find ways around that. And so one of the really useful things that has happened is to start to focus on kind of the effects of sea level rise and climate change in terms of flooding. So it's been very productive in the state at different levels to talk about flooding and address flooding from a variety of sources. You know, sea level rise is one of the most measurable changes and most obvious changes from climate change. So it's pretty much hits you in the face. It's you know, measured by tide gauges, by good old fashioned mechanical things, machines that people trust. So, you know, that evidence really goes a long way. But, you know, I think the discussion about causes is still to come. And there are places in the state where they're pushing for that discussion to happen, but we're not quite to that point at the state agency level. It's you know, it's like all of it, it's just a matter of time.
So Sydney, I'll just tack on. I mean, you know, when you live in the energy hub of the Gulf and of a lot of the country, yeah, politics matters. It has a role in these discussions for sure. That said, I've been in Louisiana for over 11 years now, and kind of like Whitney was describing, the reasons why still aren't discussed. And in fact, I worked for DEP when we had the data administration that would disallowed us from talking about sea level rise, which was really interesting because we had a whole bunch of displays that we had to somehow like account for. I would say that, I mean, the New York Times a couple of years ago did a heat map of the country about climate deniers, and it was reddest along the coast of Louisiana, where climate, you know, where changes from climate is the most noticeable. But there are a lot of projects now that are done through CPRA, that are done through organizations like ours and others, and even at the municipal level, that are responses to what is both being witnessed, felt, and predicted when it comes to sea level rise and changes in river flows and that come out of these rivers. I mean, you know, we've seen, we had record floods from 2018 all the way through early 2021 that impacted most of the Gulf of Mexico with algae blooms and really low fresh water. And so the terminology, we were talking around it maybe, but it's still being addressed way more than it was just a decade ago here, I would say.
Thank you so much. We're going to do one last question that we got in the chat from Heidi, and it's for Ben and then Whitney. So for both of you, to what extent do you think state and local government in Florida and Virginia, or I guess Virginia and then Florida respectively, are tracking the federal flood risk management standard, or the FFRMS? Is there awareness that there will be new requirements for projects with federal funding to plan for future flood risk?
I mean, the short answer is that a lot of our localities work directly with, get funding from federal agencies. So they're very familiar with whatever the requirements that are coming out of those programs, whether it's the Corps or whether it's federal highway money. So whatever the standard is that they'll have to use, they'll just have to use it. I think in Virginia, we do have through an executive order, I believe it's still in effect. It was from the last administration, that established kind of a Virginia flood risk management standard, which was pretty robust actually. It was really only for state buildings and projects, but it actually, you know, required them to account for 50 years of sea level rise under the NOAA intermediate high scenario. It was pretty robust, a lot of pretty big numbers that they had to account for, requiring to build to the V zone standard. If you're in the current zone or if you're in the sea level rise zone as well. So yes, I think, you know, we are keeping our eye on those kind of requirements, and whatever we have to do to make sure that the federal money keeps flowing to Hampton roads, we're going to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that, you know, funding is a big motivator. Local communities are dealing with crazy effects and realizing how their stormwater systems and other systems are overwhelmed and outdated. And so I think you're going to see more and more efforts to do all those things, do all the things. There will be, if there are requirements, new requirements, they're going to go after them. I mean, working with a very rural county right now in the panhandle of Florida, and they have become so adept at getting federal grants to deal with their flooding issues that I'm quite convinced that they will comply with whatever requirements they need to keep getting that funding, because there's just no alternative for some communities. They simply don't have the income stream to take care of the issues that they have without that federal assistance. So they'll do whatever they need to do. Plus the benefit of, whatever they can do to lower their CRS rating, that always helps as well.
Thank you so much, Whitney, Ben, and Seth. We are going to wrap up now. Please, before I forget, look out for that survey link in the chat that Ashley's going to post. Please take the survey and let the Coastal Society know how you felt about the webinar. Please respond. We really appreciate your responses. I want to say thank you to all of our speakers, Whitney, Ben, and Seth. I also want to say thank you to the Coastal Society for organizing this webinar, and thank you to all of you for attending. Have a great weekend.
Thanks all.
Thanks,
Take care.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Hi,
everyone.
Heidi. Hi, Rick.
Hey.
Nice job, everyone. Enjoyed it.